Welcome back to the channel. This video is on plate tectonics. We're going to focus on a global perspective of where the divergent plate boundaries are on the planet, where the convergent plate boundaries are, and the transform plate boundaries, and identifying the major plates, the minor plates, and many of the microplates around our planet, and how our surface is broken into sections and pieces called tectonic plates, which includes both the lithosphere and the crust, and describing how they join and meet at a plate boundary or margin. This is the Earth Science Classroom. We're going to start our journey of plate tectonics on our world map, which is shown here, which is a Miller cylindrical projection from 1942. And it shows us amazing topographic data information both on the terrestrial landforms and continents and also the ocean floors based on the different shades of blue, indicating bathymetric data. Now, the divergent plate boundary, also known as the mid-ocean ridge, or on land it's a rift valley, also called a spreading center, and it's a place known for its construction of new plates, new rocks of cooling magma and lava, and the beginning of plate tectonics. It's a bit like the rock cycle. You have to start somewhere, and I love to start with the cooling of magma and lava into newly formed igneous rock. In this case, newly formed lithospheric plates. Now, starting in the oceans, on the ocean floor, we have this mid-ocean ridge, which is a extremely long, up to 50,000 mile of interconnected undersea volcanoes on the ocean floor that we know as the mid-ocean ridge, and it comes in two types, the ridge and the rise. The ridge is a narrow, taller, steeper sided undersea volcano where you have the lava and magma coming up to the surface and forming that new ocean plate. A rise is the same, but it's not as tall. It is wider with more gentle gradient slopes. Comparing it to like a shield volcano with gentle slopes versus a ridge that would be more like a composite or strato volcano with that steeper sided slopes. And within the continuous chain of undersea volcanoes, which is the mid-ocean ridge, you also get the formation of transform plate boundaries and sections that also have fracture zones because of the nature of plate tectonics on a spherical surface, and you have the movements going to create different forces and speeds and motion, which will create breaks, resulting in fracture zones and small sections within the mid-ocean ridge that are actual transform plate boundaries, which are conservative plate boundaries, meaning there is no generation or forming of new plate or destruction of that plate boundary. Now we're going to start in the northern hemisphere in the Atlantic Ocean and looking at the mid-ocean ridge and all different geologic and geographic areas starting from this region of the planet. So we start with the Reykjanes Ridge, moving south through the Atlantic Ocean along the ocean floor. We're looking at the Azores Triple Junction as part of the northern Mid-Atlantic Ridge, going south to the equatorial Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which also includes the Cane and Vima fracture zones, going south off the coast of Brazil, looking at the Romanche fracture zone and into the southern Mid-Atlantic Ridge, going down to the Southern Ocean where we have the Bouvet Triple Junction, and turning and moving to the east, going across the southwest Indian Ridge, which includes the Andrew Bain fracture zone, up to the Indian Ocean Triple Junction, which it splits and goes north along the central Indian Ridge and the Carlsberg Ridge into the Red Sea and the Afar Triple Junction, which also includes the East African Rift Valley, which is that component of a divergent plate boundary or spreading center on land, and includes the Kenyan Dome and the Ethiopian Dome and the spreading center along the Red Sea. Then we go south from the Indian Ocean Triple Junction into the southeast Indian Ridge, which takes us in between Australia and Antarctica, where we have the Australian-Antarctic Discordance, and we have the Macquarie Triple Junction, which is south of New Zealand. And this divergent plate boundary continues into the Pacific Ocean as part of the Pacific Antarctic Rise, and then the East Pacific Rise as it goes up past the Chile Rise and into the equatorial regions, where we find the Galapagos Triple Junction, where it splits off into and towards the Cocos Plate and up towards the western part of Mexico and the Gulf of California, where it turns into the transform plate boundary, which is known as the San Andreas Fault Line in North America. And then to complete the continuous connected chain around the entire planet, we have the Chile Rise linking into the Scotia Plate and the South Sandwich Spreading Center, which is also a divergent plate boundary, and back towards the Bouvet Triple Junction in the Southern Ocean, right at the bottom of the South Atlantic Ocean. Now, this global connected divergent plate boundary, this mid-ocean ridge and Rift Valley in Africa, marks out and allows us to identify the boundary of the major and minor plates which make up the crust of our planet, and these lithospheric plates which are being formed at and along the divergent plate boundary, along the mid-ocean ridges and the rift valleys, create the basis for the whole system to work, and the other boundaries, convergent and transform, to fit in between the divergent plate boundaries or the spreading centers. So we have located the mid-ocean ridge rise and also the rift valleys on our planet. Now, in between and kind of interconnected with the mid-ocean ridge and the rift valleys are thousands of separate fracture zones and transform plate boundaries based on how these plates move around a three-dimensional sphere along the surface. It's bound to happen and break apart. So you find these interconnected transform plate boundaries within the divergent plate boundary system. Now we're going to talk about convergent plate boundaries, and there's two types. There's the type where you have two plates converging that are different densities that causes subduction and a trench when you have at least one oceanic tectonic plate, or you have the orogeny convergence where you have two plates of the same density which are colliding and converging and forming a mountain range or a chain of mountains. We're going to start with the Pacific Ocean, where we have the divergent plate boundary combination of the East Pacific Rise and the Antarctic Pacific Rise, forming new lithospheric crustal plates. And the plates are moving across the surface, and you have convergence on the edge or around the outside of the Pacific Ocean. So we're going to start with discussing the various subduction zones and trenches that occur around the edge of the Pacific Ocean, creating the Pacific Ring of Fire. And this is between two plates that converge with different densities, and one is subducting under the other. So in the southern Pacific Ocean around New Zealand, we're going to start with the Kermadec Trench, the Tonga Trench further north, going across to the New Hebrides Trench, then across to the Philippine Trench and the Yap Trench, and in between, around Indonesia, you have the Java or Sunda Trench. Then we go across to the deepest trench in the world, the Mariana Trench. Then we have the Ryukyu Trench between Japan and Taiwan. Then we have the Izu-Ogasawa Trench south of Japan. Then we have the Japan Trench east of Japan. Then we have the Kuril-Kamchatka Trench, which connects Japan up to the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia. Then we have the larger Aleutian Trench going across North America and South Aleutian Islands. Then we get the Cascadia subduction zone around the Juan de Fuca Plate in northwest US and Canada. Then we have the Middle America Trench off the western coast of Mexico and Central America. And then finally down through the Peru-Chile Trench, which extends all the way down from the northern part of South America all the way down to the southern part of Chile and Argentina and Patagonia. Now we're going to add in the other type of convergent plate boundary between two plates converging and colliding, which is going to be the orogeny, or the mountain building, where you have the two plates of similar or same density with limited subduction, basically colliding and causing folding and mountain formation. Now, the biggest one on our planet is the Alpine Himalayan orogeny belt, which extends from basically Spain and Africa all the way across east through the Mediterranean, through countries like Italy and Greece, into Turkey, through the Middle East, into areas of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and over to the Himalayan mountain orogeny belt and the Tibetan Plateau, and across into parts of Southeast Asia. Then we come back to the Atlantic Ocean. We discuss two areas of convergence, which causes a subduction zone and a trench, and the first being the Puerto Rico Trench around the Eastern Caribbean and the Lesser Antilles, and the South Sandwich subduction zone in the Southern Ocean around the Sandwich Islands. And in the Mediterranean, we have a smaller subduction zone and trench called the Hellenic Trench, and extends from southern Italy and Sicily across the Mediterranean to the east to southern Greece. So we have located so far we have talked about and added into the world map the divergent plate boundaries, including the rise, the rift valley, and the ridges, and also added in the convergent plate boundaries, both with subduction zones and orogeny belts. Now we've got to add in the last plate boundary, the transform plate boundary, which is a conservative plate boundary, which means that two plates are moving alongside each other, either in the same direction or in opposite directions, and this is generally called a strike-slip fault line. And we're going to focus on the main transform plate boundaries around the world, because if we're to look at all the different fault lines around the planet, there are literally thousands of different, separate, and individual fault lines across the planet. Again, they are focused and concentrated in certain areas of the planet, but there are too many for this video. So we're going to look at and focus on just the main large transform plate boundaries. We're going to begin in the Southern Ocean between South America and Antarctica and look at the fault lines around the Scotia Plate, which include the Shackleton Fracture Zone and the Magalhães-Fagano Fault. Then move up into the Caribbean, or the Caribbean and Central America, which includes multiple faults, which includes the Orient Fault, the Enriquillo Fault, the Septentrional Fault, Montague-Polochic Fault, Walton Fault Zone, and the El Pilar Fault. Then moving into North America and the US, looking at the San Andreas Fault line system throughout California, and it turns into the Mendocino Fracture Zone as it moves off into the Pacific Ocean to the west, and further up into British Columbia in Canada, looking at the Queen Charlotte Fault, and then moving over to New Zealand and Oceania, looking at the Alpine Fault, which kind of transects the South Island of New Zealand towards the North Island, and then coming into the Middle East, where we have the Dead Sea Transform Fault System that extends from the Red Sea up and connects into the East Anatolian Fault in Turkey, and then next to that will be the North Anatolian Fault, and there are other smaller fault lines in the Greek, Cyprus, Turkey region of the world, which includes the Kefalonia Fault, the Aceres Fault, and the Ovachik Fault. And as mentioned prior, there are literally thousands of smaller fault lines, but we just mentioned the major transform faults around the world, which connect between the convergent and divergent plate boundaries we've already drawn in. Going back to the early 1900s with scientists like Alfred Wegener and Harry Hess and Holmes and Vine and Matthews and John Tuzo Wilson, who collectively understood the Earth's surface was moving and broken into pieces that were called tectonic plates, which include the lithosphere and the crust. The crust is in two divisions, either oceanic, which is thinner and denser, or continental, which is thicker and less dense. And these act as a global puzzle with each piece fitting together along a plate boundary. And we've drawn the divergent plate boundaries, the convergent plate boundaries, and the transform plate boundaries. And together they form the understanding of plate tectonics and how our planet's surface is shaped and reshaped over a long period of geologic time between supercontinents and rifting, which involves the stages of the Wilson cycle. So now we have all three plate boundaries marked on our world map. We can look at and identify the major and minor plates. The major plates include the North American, the Eurasian, the African, South American, Pacific, Antarctic plate, and the Indo-Australian plate. Some maps have the Indian plate separate from the Australian plate, but as there's no definitive, very obvious boundary, we call it the Indo-Australian plate. Then we have the smaller minor tectonic plates, including the Caribbean, the really coolly named Cocos plate, the Juan de Fuca, which could also be a microplate, the Nazca plate, the Scotia plate, the Philippine plate, and the Arabian plate. This is the Earth Science Classroom. Thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, please subscribe, like, and share. And if you want more content and videos on Earth Science, please check out my channel.